who is Ben Hine, who will be speaking about Lost Dads, research findings on divorced fathers. Ben is from the United Kingdom. He's a professor of applied psychology at the University of West London. Have I got it right? Good. Ben, you can take the stage.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, so my name is Ben Hine. I'm Professor of Applied Psychology at the University of West London. And I wanted to speak today about a topic. It will become clear how it is related to shared parenting and the necessity of pushing people towards shared parenting. But this is a project that was funded by the Woodward Charitable Trust in the UK, where we were examining fathers' experiences of family breakdown in a holistic way. So trying to track, okay, from, the moment of breakdown, what are the kind of trajectories that develop for fathers, and where did those trajectories originate within the relationship? And I've been to some really, really interesting talks today that have actually kind of echoed where those foundations might come from. So in terms of background, just to say, family breakdown, the phrase family breakdown is defined as the ending of a relationship, including formal separation and divorce between those who have children. And in 2020, there were over 100,000 divorces granted in England and Wales alone. And overall in the UK, 42% of marriages end in divorce. And at least half of the couples that have at least one child under the age of 16, and 20% of those have one that's under 5 years old. So there's a lot of separation and divorce occurring, and a lot of which involves children. So when we focus on fathers, and as a preface to this, family breakdown, separation and divorce is a traumatic time for everyone involved. And I think we all kind of know that and agree that. The reason we wanted to focus on fathers specifically is because of some heightened or gender-specific risk factors that we see in fathers, particularly in the context of the UK, where so many fathers then become the non-resident parent. They're the one that then leaves the home. So previous research on the experiences showed that fathers do experience a lot of loss when a family breakdown is experienced, more so potentially than mothers do because of these factors. So they are the ones that more frequently lose contact with their children, especially in the UK, because there is not a presumption of 50-50 care. So often fathers fall to a minority time slot, if at all, usually sometimes kind of 80-20 or less, every other weekend type thing. So they're the ones that predominantly lose contact with children, which, as we know, is hugely nourishing for mental health, identity, and general life experience. They report a loss of control, a loss of their father identity, which again is linked back to the loss of contact, and also huge financial loss because of the way that separation and divorce is still constructed in the UK. A lot of the time when the fathers then become the non-resident parent, they then have a financial obligation to then support the resident parent, which can be a huge financial burden when then also supporting a new residence as well as the old one and children. Fathers have previously reported grief, and again, this kind of taps into a lot of the parental alienation literature. When you lose contact and lose time with children, either by accident or design, there is a grief that comes with that loss. And fathers have previously spoken around issues defining parental responsibility and the overwhelmingly negative experiences that they have in that process. The lack of joint custody, the lack of, for example, mediation, and also the traumatizing experiences of the family justice system, which I will come to in a second. Also less well studied, but increasingly so, including my own work and that of Liz Bates in the UK, Denise Hines in the US, is around abuse towards men, particularly post-separation, when opportunities that maybe weren't previously there then present. And what I mean by that is because men become the non-resident parent, there are more than opportunities for coercive control around contact transfer, etc. And men have reported in the IPV literature around the use of children as a form of abuse, which then has led to a growing literature, again, my own work around parental alienation specifically. So the purposeful and targeted use of children against the father. Unsurprisingly, there is a range of emotions that have been previously linked to both partners following family breakdown, but specifically fathers as well. I won't go through them because they're all the kind of classic contenders, obviously the hurt, but also anger, frustration, which, as I will come to later, often presents men in a double bind because they often can't express these emotions for fear of being presented as a poor, emotionally dysregulated father who then can't be left responsible for their children. In terms of the impact, previous research has suggested, again, for both parties, but with an elevated risk for men around, having work and financial difficulties, poorer health. This one is one of the ones that stands out most predominantly in the literature, is increased risk of suicidal ideation and suicide completion, because men are around 11 times more likely to engage in suicidal ideation following divorce than women. So there's clearly a gender elevated risk there. And that's, of course, not saying that women don't ever become suicidal following divorce, but men are clearly at greater risk. There have also preliminarily been some identification of coping mechanisms for men, but within this literature, it's predominantly focused around the barriers that men feel in terms of engaging with coping mechanisms, particularly things like therapy and social support, which someone mentioned earlier, tend to be very femininely constructed. So they're constructed in ways that men don't necessarily want to engage with. Someone was talking about even the way to position men in a setting, don't have them facing each other. Men don't like to look at anyone else when they're being vulnerable. Lots of different explanations for that, ranging from the social to the evolutionary. But the best way to get men to talk is to put them side by side and engage them in an activity. And that's why we have lots of support networks in the UK, for example, things like men's sheds that get men to build things and talk whilst they build things, because then they don't have to look at someone and go, I'm really vulnerable. But we know that most classical therapy setups are you sit and you talk to someone, and men don't necessarily like that. Also focusing on hobbies, sometimes seeking professional help. But this literature hasn't really explored potentially some of the more negative coping mechanisms that men engage with. So what this project did, and I've realized these boxes are not going to fill themselves, which is very annoying. So I will fill them. You just have to imagine that, and I'll edit them later. Basically, this project was a multi-method, multi-study project. I'm only actually going to talk about one of the studies today, which I think is why these are empty, and I was meant to fill them. But anyway, so we did a case review with over 1,000 client data that had engaged with a service supporting men. I can't talk about that today because I don't have time, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And we also ran a focus group for organizations supporting men to understand their perspective. But the largest studies that we ran was a qualitative survey with fathers, asking about their experiences from within the relationship all the way through to the present day, which was an absolutely massive survey. And I was deeply grateful to anybody who made it through it. And we also then interviewed, as a follow-up to that, 30 of those fathers more in detail on their experiences. And one, just to kind of give an indication as to the richness of the data, but also the desperation to speak, was one of the interviews that we logged on to. We were meant to be conducting, one of these boxes should have said, semi-structured interviews, which is where you have a rough schedule, but you let the participant lead the narrative. One of the fathers that we logged on with, after we introduced the study, we then said, tell us about your experiences. And he spoke uninterrupted for 55 minutes, which a lot of interviews were typically that long in total. So this, we just kind of placed our script aside and just listened. And he said it was the first, not just the first time someone had kind of had the opportunity to speak about his experiences, but he said it was the first time that someone seemed to care about it. So it wasn't necessarily that he hadn't had the opportunity, but it was also that he had never had someone go, this is a valid experience, which obviously we were doing. So what it should say here is semi-structured interviews. We distributed the surveys through various supporting charities within the UK and also through social media. So obviously a limitation there is a self-selecting sample. But more importantly is what we found. And I'm just going to make sure I've got my quotes. So we found 6 main themes within the data. And the first was around talking about the family breakdown, separation and divorce event itself. So many of the men talked about stresses that developed during the relationship as the precipitation of the family breakdown. And that sounds obvious because it's very rare that family breakdown just flies out of nowhere. But it was interesting to talk to the men and learn about what they viewed as those stressors. And many of them situated on the life stresses associated with pregnancy, birth, and caring for young children, through which they got very little support. So as a father myself and someone who's had 2 children in the UK, this echoed my experiences in terms of the pre and postnatal care barely being sufficient for the mother, let alone for the father. And I felt like I might as well have not been in the room for most of the time. And there was no rigorous assessment whatsoever of how I was coping, my mental health, etc., a little bit for my wife. So it needs to improve for everyone, but we need to at least start recognizing fathers as co-parents. And the quote that I've picked out was, dealing with a small baby was a big source of additional conflicts. How you take care of them, what strategy to adopt, what activities, when, how, all of that, that was all a source of conflict. And I've heard other people speak about, there isn't a manual for parenting and there often isn't a lot of postnatal support. That's one of the interesting things about doing antenatal classes is you get a lot of support about what's going to happen at the birth, what to expect at the birth, not a lot for afterwards, especially in the UK. I know maybe in other countries it might be different. Then with the onset of the breakdown event, there were a variety of things that precipitated that event, and a lot of the different experiences were unique, but all the men described it as this kind of roller coaster experience. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. And the quote I've got is, that's one of the big problems, is there's just so much uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know if you're going to stay at your house. You don't know if you're going to see your child anymore. You don't know if you're going to be robbed blind by your ex and lose all your life savings. There's just so much uncertainty. So men really feel adrift with no support during this time. And the negative emotions that we saw in the previous literature were supported in this study as well. Confusion, frustration, guilt, pain and hurt, anger, sadness, shock, and stress. I feel like I've been totally put in a sack and kicked by about 20 big men. My insides are painful as hell because of what's happened and what she's done to me. There was also, that came through, a lot of domestic violence and abuse. And this was both during the relationship, covering physical, psychological, financial, sexual gaslighting and coercion, and then moving to post-separation abuse. And the interesting thing was that there was fairly even split between some men who had had, a perfectly fine relationship. There was a bit of conflict, not what we would call abuse. The relationship broke down, and then the abuse started because of the opportunity presented in non-residency. And a mixture of other men who'd experienced abuse all the way through their intact relationship and then after that. So in terms of during the relationship, the quote is, what happened is that when she got quite abusive, at some point she would flip out and be out of control. That was the feeling anyway. Anything could happen. It was ultimately the worst part. It was psychological abuse because I ended up being really afraid. I was unable to sleep. And then we get into the post-separation abuse around contact being used as a tool. So being able to kind of coercively control through threat of contact, even further limited contact, a pressure to comply with demands in order to precipitate contact, placed a huge amount of financial strain and financial abuse, so specifically utilizing strategies and legal systems in order to extract and financially cripple the fathers. And then, of course, a huge chunk of fathers mentioned behaviors that were specifically representative of parental alienation. And this quote here really kind of captures that. The reality is that for as long as my children or me or my ex-partner are alive, she's going to do her damnedest to make my life a living hell and to diminish, minimize, and destroy whatever relationship and contact I have with my children. I can't do anything about that. So this real, highlighting of the actual abuse, but also that sense of hopelessness that is accompanying that abuse. A lot of the issues and the friction came through negotiating parental responsibility, contact, residency, etc. So when the FBSD event had occurred, there was very, very little support no support in place in order to help parents to do this. And so while some people did do it themselves, some obviously ended up in court, and even though they wanted to avoid it, they then had uniformly negative experiences in court. I didn't obviously have a single father that said, yeah, went to court, it was great, got the result I wanted, no problem. And I mean, again, that's not surprising because, the term I hear bandied around is that there are no winners in family court. But the interesting thing that came out for fathers specifically is that they identified, or they argued, that the system was fundamentally against them as fathers. And the interesting thing for me was looking at the trajectory between an intact relationship where the father reported that they already felt second fiddle as the secondary parent, and that disadvantage and that positioning was mirrored all the way through their journey. So in the FBSD event, they were the ones that had to move out and lost contact. Then in court, they were the ones that were vilified and not seen as important, etc. So there was a real thread of that disadvantage throughout the whole process, which is why I found some of the talks earlier, like Elena's talk about, focusing on things like attachment parenting that place the mother as the primary parent. That can be really damaging for couples, both the mother and the father, but particularly post-separation, because you have one player in the game immediately at disadvantage. So the two quotes for this, for negotiation, I've been trying to negotiate with her and through her solicitors for the past 2 years for some extra time, and it's just been blocked constantly. So I'm finding that impossible. And that's one of the reasons that I felt I had to raise court action. And for the dissatisfaction, it's very frustrating how inequitable the process is and how it very much benefits the resident parent, who in the UK is overwhelmingly the mother. The resident parent can basically do whatever they want and get away with it. And there was a real highlighting by the fathers that there was no justice in and no pushback for any kind of violation of contact orders when mothers were the ones violating. I think you can probably guess what I'm going to be saying here in terms of the impact on fathers. It is not good. So fathers, the predominant theme is loss. And this loss goes across all the domains you can think of. They feel this profound loss everywhere. Financially, they feel it with their relationship with their children and contact with their children. They talk about this kind of, or rather they didn't say this phrase, but it's characterized as this disembodied grief, because they're mourning a person who is still walking around and is alive, but they can't have access to, they don't see. So they really, really struggle with this profound sense of loss, but also their loss as fathers as well, and their ability to enact their parenting role. And alongside that loss, just profound mental health issues, and suicidality came up all the time, with fathers saying things like, I think I've lost track of the quotes, but they were saying around one that really struck with me was someone said, if you can't see your children, what's the point? And that was it. That was the quote. You know, if you can't see your children, what's the point? And that spoke to this really kind of, you know, talking about its phrasing of primalness, this primal instinct to, you know, I think particularly for fathers to protect, provide, all of these things that through either evolutionary or social design, we feel compelled as fathers to do. These fathers felt that they were forbidden from doing, and they found it very difficult to cope. And then finally, the financial impact, especially for fathers who then ended up in the court process, running up tens and tens of thousands of pounds, fighting for what little contact time that they could get. And obviously, this is the impact on children as reported by fathers, many of whom didn't have a lot of contact with their children. So this is, you know, take these results with a pinch of salt, because we didn't speak to children directly. But all the fathers spoke about how children were confused about what was happening and why it was happening, that the children were clearly suffering from anxiety and other mental health issues due to their positioning within the couple, and also that they were experiencing loss as well. And this speaks to people like Jen Harmon's work that was outlined late last year on the losses to the child in the context of parental alienation, because they are also losing a good enough parent. They are also losing opportunities to see extended family, like grandparents, for example, etc. The fifth theme was around coping. So how did men then cope with these crushing mental health issues? Many of them turned to what we might term, quote unquote, unhealthy coping strategies. I don't hugely love that term. It's why I haven't included it, because at the end of the day, you cope how you cope. Who am I to judge whether it's healthy or unhealthy? But typically, these are activities that we would, in a health psychology sense, designate as unhealthy. So things like excessive drinking, substance use and misuse, but also things like throwing themselves into work and working 24/7 just to be distracted from what was going on. So back on the quotes, I found my place. If I didn't drink, then I didn't sleep. I was just too wired. So that became the mechanism. But there were other healthy coping mechanisms that were reported as well, such as exercise and meditation. The only way I can really disconnect is when I'm working and when I'm away doing a lot of trekking, and that's my way to escape from all of this. And one of the things that really came through, which actually was one of the positive sub-themes, although they are rare in this study, was that actually men reported that they did get a lot of support from friends and family, which is great, because often men don't reach out. So I don't know whether it was about this particular sample, but they did report that the family and friends were very supportive and that they drew a lot of strength from them. A couple of other friends were just there to speak to. It was good. I was lucky. I don't think I'd have been in such a good mental state of mind if I didn't have a couple of very switched on people to speak to. And even though they said that the professional support out there was too little, there were too few organizations, when they did reach out, they said that they were really effective, and they named a few of the charities in the UK that I know do great work and that I have worked with as well. And finally, we asked participants to reflect on the past, their current situation, and thoughts for the future. So the past advice for other fathers was very mixed. So some of it was, hang in there, you can do it. And others was, you're screwed, essentially, and there's no point. So that was a real mix in there of trying to keep things positive for other fathers in that situation, but also facing the reality that their experience had been crushingly brutal. When you look at current circumstances, many of the men said that they were happy to be free from their previous relationship, because many of them had reported that it was abusive and not very nice, but also they carried this huge burden ongoing of still fighting for their children, or if they had given up that fight, the resignation, the burden of the resignation that they would never see their children, or that they, you know, were stuck in the position that they were. And finally, when looking at the future, it was all just situated on legal reform. Everybody spoke around legal reform and increased support. So this is just kind of the concluding paragraph from this study, and then I'll quickly talk about the recommendations from the report. So the men in this survey and those interviewed described a substantial array of challenges following family breakdown, largely centered around the establishing of parental responsibility. So those discussions, those processes around figuring out what to do with the children were where a lot of the post-separation conflict lay. The toll that it took on fathers and their children, especially in relation to mental health, was extensive, and they often struggled to cope. And just to put that into context with the other study that we did, of the 1,000 men that had approached the charity within the 12 months span that we looked at, 45% were actively suicidal when they approached the service. You know, that is a major public health issue. And I have always said, I don't think it's that hard to follow the trail of breadcrumbs between the mental health issues in family courts and the fact that suicide is the #1 killer of men in the UK under 55. I don't think it's that hard to follow that bread trail. And there is work on that as well, the relationship between PA and suicide in fathers particularly. It was particularly exaggerated when men also reported the experiences of abuse, and many of the men spoke about how children were used as part of the abusive behavior, experiencing things like PABs. Experiences of support were mixed, as were their outlooks on the situation and the future. So the recommendations of the report come from across the 3 studies. So these are drawn from the quantitative study, the study I've just spoken about, and the focus group that we did with organizations. And I just very quickly rattle through them. So the first and probably most common was about legal change. And that speaks to a rebuttal presumption of 50-50 shared care, because at the moment, there is no such assumption. So what that means is that the default setting that most UK couples fall to is mother main, father secondary. And we know that in various countries, like Finland, for example, and other jurisdictions, for example, in the US, Kentucky, where they've trialed or routinely have 50-50, hardly anyone uses family courts, because they don't have to, because the assumption is 50-50. You only go to family court if you want to change that in any way. Whereas men in this study felt compelled to go to court, even to just try and get to 50-50, or anything above 20, or anything above 10, or anything above 0. So you're priming people to go into a legal system that is not designed to produce very positive outcomes. The other thing, just to very quickly say about this then, about transforming the system, is that the legal system, particularly in the UK, I know there's lots of countries here at the moment, too many couples are going to the family court system as a first port of call. And the president of the family court, Sandra McFarlane, has said the principal objective at the moment is need reduction. We need to keep people out of courts in the first place, because what you're having more and more is couples who are maybe a little bit conflictual, but probably could be sorted out, going to court, they're pulled apart. And if anybody's seen the film A Marriage Story, the type of lawyer in that Laura Dern plays is exactly the type of thing where you go in, you say, what can we use? Tell me everything that's happened and how can we spin it, because they want to win. And that's no offense to lawyers. I know we have many here, but you know, it's the job there, but there needs to be some addressment of that. Thirdly, and very quickly, we need FBSD triage. We need support at the point of family breakdown. And there is none really at the moment at all. And that's very different to other countries where it's much more successful. And finally, we need cultural change. We need to change this idea of fathers as secondary. They are co-parents, and they are there to be a full-time 50-50 co-parent. And that's how it should be. That's all my contact detail. And when the report is finally published, which should actually be in the next month, I will make sure to share it with the committee so they can share it with you. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you.